The first thing I'd like to ask is, when did you join the service?
Well, I didn't join the service. I was drafted in 1954. I was drafted. And I was working at that time in Kenton, Ohio, and fixing to get married. And as a matter of fact, I did get married just before I went in the service. And my wife was the last child at home, so we decided we'd get married. So anyway, I went ahead in the service, and I served my time in Germany, and I was there in Germany finished basic training, and went up to Germany, and I was there about 3 months. And my wife's mother passed away, so she joined me about 2 months later. So we really liked our tour in Germany, and I came home and got out of service and stayed out about 6 or 7 months, and I kind of liked the service, and I stayed in the active reserve. And make a long story short, I thought I'd like the Army better than working in civilian life. So I joined the Army, came back in, and stayed for 30 years.
Wow. Okay. Well, where did you go to basic training at?
I took my basic training in Fort Knoxville, Kentucky.
What was that like?
Well, that was...
well, let me ask you this first of all. How old were you, I should say?
When I took my basic training, I was 21 years old.
Okay.
21 years old. It was kind of demanding, very physical. At that time, it was 12 weeks long. But I didn't really mind that because I was in good physical condition, and I kind of liked it was in July. The weather was hot. That was the only thing that bothered me. The weather was extremely hot, but going to the ranges and stuff and up early in the morning didn't really bother me that much, to be frank with you. But it was pretty demanding, and some of the guys, 4 or 5 of the guys, I guess, didn't make it. But in most cases, it really helped you to learn teamwork, appreciate teamwork, and that's where I really first became to really love the Army, to be frank with you.
Wow.
It sure did.
So I take it you think the training was very realistic and helpful?
Very realistic, and also given by a very professional, dedicated soldiers. And I still remember my company commander, Second Lieutenant Collins, who never asked us to do anything that he didn't do. So I really had a lot of respect for him and his cadre personnel. That was really very, very good.
Well, before you were drafted, had you traveled much?
Oh, and by the way, while we're on training there, I'd just like to make one thing clear, which I hear a lot of remarks said about abuse and digging holes and mistreating soldiers and stuff in basic training and what have you. And this was in 1954. And I can honestly say that no cadre member ever used profanity or mistreated a soldier in any way that I was aware of at that time. And I've heard of those things before, and it's always I've always kind of doubted that situation, to be honest with you. So I just want to make it clear that we took hard, long days of training, but our cadre was always fair and good to us, really. They really cared for us, but now they really did train us hard. There's no question about that.
Yeah, undoubtedly they rode you pretty good. So
yes, sir. They sure did. But they made good soldiers out of us.
Well, had you traveled before much? Had you been in that part of the country, maybe is a better way to put it, before?
No. I was born up in Overton County, and my dad was a coal miner, and when I was a teenager, he had moved to Findlay, Ohio, because he couldn't get a job here in Tennessee, and I was schooled there and mostly raised in Ohio. And then when I was drafted in, like I said, I went to Germany, and that was really my first time out of the country. But of course, over the period of the last 32 years I was in the service, I did a lot of travel. That was one trip of 5, which I made to Germany incidentally. That was my first of 5 trips. And I also made 3 trips to Vietnam.
Well, when you were in basic training, I'm sure you remember some of the soldiers that went through with you.
Yes.
Do you remember meeting any fellows that were coming from different parts of the country? In other words, was your first exposure to people from different parts of the country?
Yes, that was quite interesting. And at that time, if you recall, I said I was drafted. And all of us were drafted. I don't recall any of the ones that was in the training with me that had volunteered. We were all draftees. And I remember, for example, there was one kid there by the name of Wagner. I believe his name was Wagner. He was a black soldier, but he's a very good soldier. And he was a professional baseball player. He had a contract with the Cleveland Indians, and he played on our company softball team and was quite good. And you had a very vast, different talent in the company. I remember we had good basketball players, good volleyball players, good softball players. We didn't play baseball there, and didn't play football. Of course, it wasn't football season at that time. But you really met a lot of interesting people. I thought they were very interesting, and from all different walks of life and stuff. It was very good experience, I thought, to share with people.
Education all to itself.
Yes.
What unit were you in?
I was with the 1st Brigade, and our company was called B Company, 1st Brigade of the 199th Infantry, I believe it was called at that time.
Okay. And your duties? What were your duties?
My duties were just, and basic training was just a training soldier. That's what we all of us were.
Okay.
Trainees.
Well, tell me about your first trip to Germany.
First trip to Germany. I went by boat, and that was a experience all in itself. It was 8 days on the ship, and we did stop in we did stop in Southampton, England, and we docked there, and we were off about 20 hours. The ship stayed there, and the captain let us off in shifts. We went off 8 hours. It wasn't exactly 8 hours because we were on about 8 hours. We was there 20 hours, so we got to go off 8 hours. And then when that half came back on, the other half went off. He didn't want everybody off the ship at the same time. I guess there's reasons for that. So that was our first time to step foot on foreign land, and then we went on to Bremerhaven, Germany, where we finally offloaded off the ship and got on trains and went to our various locations. And I went to Zweibrücken, and from Zweibrücken I was assigned to Butzbach, Germany, which was in the northern part of Germany. We were occupation forces at that time. Now this was 1954, and I was assigned to the 4th Infantry Division there, and I recall going to I was all kind of scared about getting into couldn't speak English or couldn't speak German rather, and you're in a foreign country and all kinds of thoughts come through your mind. And I figured out my train would get in about dark, and here I am, I can just see myself in the depot there and can't speak the old German, and nobody to meet me, and what'll I do that night, so. But that wasn't the way it happened. I got there, and here was a lieutenant and a sergeant there to meet me, and matter of fact, there was 3 of us going to the same unit. I met all 3 of us. They really took good care of us and got us back to the barracks and fed us a good meal to begin with, and really made us feel welcome, and that was a good time. It was off to a good start.
Well, tell me about a typical day when you were in Germany.
Okay, a typical day there, living in the barracks, of course, that's considerably different than when you're married and living off post. But there's good points, there's bad points. You got the right roommates and everything. It's not too bad, really. I enjoyed it there for 3 months while I was there. Anyway, a typical day would be getting up about 5:30 in the morning and cleaning your room and helping your share of the hallway and the bathrooms, and then going on to breakfast. And then your first formation in the morning would be usually at 7:30. And then usually you would work till about 4 to 5 o'clock, and you'd be totally free. So you was all on your own. And generally, at that time, we didn't work Saturday and Sunday unless we had special training, and you had quite a bit of leisure time. So, and that was good because we had a service club there, and you could take a lot of tours, and the older people have been there longer. Of course, they took care of the new people. They let you out of town right away until you become familiar with what you were doing and some basic language and this type of thing, so you at least know how to ride the streetcars and stuff. So it was real nice. Very nice.
How were you treated by the German population?
Well, the German population at that time, I said we were occupation force. What meant that the war hadn't been over 10 years and the United States, so to speak, was running their government for them. And I remember you go into the bigger cities like Frankfurt or Stuttgart or something, you'd see all kinds of the war ruins because they had not built back up that much at that time. Also, they were really having a hard time because they didn't have jobs. And, well, you can imagine what the country was like at that time. And we had a lot of them that worked on our military concerns. They did such jobs as perform KP. In a lot of cases, they even performed guards, believe it or not, for us. And they were also barbers, and there was tailors. And of course, these jobs was created mostly to help the local economy. That was part of the Americans' way of helping to bring the country back, is providing them such jobs. And I recall the morning at the gate, there would always be like 25 or 30 extra Germans waiting there at the gate for jobs. And if someone was off or something, then they'd call to the gate and have that person sent in to perform the job of whoever that person was off. So that's how bad they needed jobs. And every morning there'd be 15 or 20 or maybe 25 people waiting there at the gate, till a call come in to see if they would get to work that day. Also, at that time they were building quarters for the American families. And they built all of the quarters, and they're still that way today in Germany. Of course, they're not used for that purpose, but they had a typical German set of apartments was 18 apartments. You'd have the basement would be for your washrooms and those type of facilities. Then you'd have your 3 full floors, and then the 4th floor would be in kind of the attic-like, but it would be single rooms and have 4 or 5 bathrooms for each 3 or 4 rooms. And the purpose of the attic rooms was for maids. And there again, that was to create jobs for the Germans. And each apartment that they signed had a maid's room with it. And they would wait in line if they found out your maid's room was empty, while they would come and want to perform maid duties for you because they had no place to live, and that'd give them a place to live. And just usually, if you furnished them the room, why, that was sufficient. They'd babysit for you, help you clean your house, etc. stuff. So another thing that a lot of people don't realize happened, but many things like that happened during the time of war, I guess.
Well, but obviously you saw America helping Germany after the war. I mean, you were there, obviously.
Yes.
How did you feel about that? Did that bother you, or did you think it was a good thing?
Well, me, it personally didn't bother me. And be honest with you, in most cases, not in most cases, but there was a few cases where the Germans would resent the Americans. But the Americans I was mostly associated with younger Americans like me. And we didn't seem to resent them too much. Really, not much that I come in contact with anyway. But occasionally maybe the older soldier would have a run-in with a German, or they'd say something about him, or, tell some story in the mess hall or something where, some German, got on them, didn't think the war was over, this type of talk or something like that. But by and large, it wasn't, that big a deal. We had other things going too. For example, at that particular time, I recall when I first got to my unit, the Army was just being integrated. Truman signed the proclamation, I think, in 1948 to end segregation in the Army. But it didn't hide. In the 4th Infantry Division, for example, and that was 1954, and the talk in the barracks was, hey, your roommate might be black, or your platoon sergeant might be black, or this, that, and the other. And I went through that the first year I was there, and believe it or not, there was no problem whatsoever. And that just the blacks, we transferred some whites over and blacks over, and that went real good. There was no problem with it at all in our unit. Basically none throughout the command that I knew about. So we had a lot of things going on, at that time.
Well, what about the Russians? What were the thought about the Russians at that time?
Oh, well, now, that was a different story. that was we were all given our communist cards, we call them, and you were trained on the Berlin Wall and the northern part of Germany, where you didn't go to certain places and this type of thing. And also, we were on a very, very high state of alert there at that time. We had what they call readiness. You'd have a readiness test, and you never knew when that was. And what that readiness test meant was you had 1 hour to get all your troops in. You had to have, I think it was 90% of them at that time, and you had to clear your concern and be at your field location within an hour, or you would do this over again. And nobody wanted to do that over again, so everybody really hustled when the bell rang for an alert. And that, when I say you had to be, that would mean you have to get all your vehicles. And in most cases, some of them were preloaded, but some of the stuff you had to load, your weapons stuff you had to load. So you'd really have to work as a team and have to do it very quickly and very fast. And then you'd assemble in a certain area and then have roll call and check all of your equipment, check all the soldiers for their personal gear. And we were always at a high state of readiness at that time. And that was because of the communist, and the Berlin situation and the Soviet situation. Yeah, that was in our top priority with us. It was very definitely on our minds about that.
So you thought it was a good idea to help the German people and the Russian trade?
And I think that's another thing that helped to pull the American and the Germans together, because the Germans feared the Soviets as well as we did. And so quite naturally, that was a comfort to each one, because we both considered Russia as our enemy. Maybe we were drilled in it a little too harder than it really was, but that's not for me to say. As it turned out, as you see now, we're friends with them too, so who knows?
Well, certainly, when you're over there, it was a different time.
That's true.
Sure.
That's very true. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned that a lot of times you would have some free time.
Yes.
In Germany. Where did you go and what sort of thing did you do?
Well, we would, I liked to go out and visit the castles myself. Of course, there was any number of things that you could do, if you wanted to go to, on tours, and that they had service. I mentioned the service club. That's a place where soldiers can go and check out, various tours and travel things, and right in your own town, they have tours right there sometimes. But me personally, I like going to the castles. I also at that time liked traveling to the bigger cities and seeing some of the war runs, and I took a lot of pictures. And that was very interesting. Their old the churches, and I like the history type things. And I went to Cologne several times. That's one of the older religious large cathedrals, and I thought all that was interesting. So you really had enough to keep you busy. And if you wanted to play sports, we also had football teams and the baseball teams and all types of things like that for the military to get involved with. And then, of course, at that time, the dependents were arriving there, and you had scouting you could get involved with. You could get involved with Little League Baseball, all types of things. And then, like I told you earlier, my wife, she came over about 3 months, and we had our first child was born there, and she did a lot of travel with me. And we were fortunate enough to have a car. I think there was only like 2 or 3 of us in our whole company that had a car, and my wife had shipped a car over, so we had a car. At that time, there was hardly no cars on the Autobahn. You could go we were in Bootsbach which was south to Frankfurt, which was about 40 or 50 miles, and the Autobahn being the interstate, what that is. And you might pass only 2 or 3 cars. And so traveling was very easily. And not only that, traveling was very inexpensive, because we got to buy gasoline over there, and very, very, very cheap. Remember on the stuff on the foreign lands, when the soldiers buy it through the PX and stuff, there's no federal tax or tax on it when it's bought in a country like that. So you had no tax on your gasoline. I think our gas was like 7 or 8, 10 cents a gallon. Like cigarettes would be, 5 or 10 cents a pack or something like that. Stuff like that. Your alcohol didn't have no tax on it. So those type of things are very cheap, and you could travel. Of course, we didn't make a lot of money, but it didn't take a lot of money to travel and this and that and the other too. So that was always nice.
Well, when you traveled to the bigger cities, you mentioned you took a lot of pictures and saw a lot of ruins from the war.
Yes.
But it was still extensive, even in 1954. Would you say it was widespread destruction, or had they started rebuilding?
Oh, it was there in '54. It was widespread destruction. They could not build their first in the occupation forces. They were only authorized to do certain things, and some of the things was they couldn't build certain factories and what have you at that time, and it was just. I don't recall exactly all the restrictions he put on them, but it seemed like they didn't clean many of them. Now they worked on some of them. I can't say it was totally ruined, but there was lots of ruins there. But then after that was over, then they got their government back, and then they started building. And so that was 1954. Then my next return to Germany was in '62, and you could hardly even tell there was a war, for example, in '62. That's how much progress had been made. So it was just absolutely phenomenal with it. And also, a lot of their cities, because they were almost totally destroyed and what have you, now that was kind of later years, they're a lot more modern cities, and they have freeways through them and et cetera. So they're more modern today than if they hadn't not been destroyed. You go along with me, of course, I wouldn't say destroy a country to make it modern.
Yeah.
But there was some help to things like that. Sure, you understand that, I'm sure.
Well, when you were in Germany in '54, did you get the feeling that anyone in Germany, particularly the Germans, probably a few who were resentful? You mentioned some who didn't believe the war was over. Did you see anyone or hear anyone outside of just sort of hearsay, anyone say anything about maybe Hitler was right and they wanted the Nazis back or any of that? Or did it seem like everyone was wholeheartedly against what the Nazi regime
No. I have personally heard and witnessed in some cases. For example, I told you my wife came over about 3 months after we were there, and we rented an apartment on the economy. We didn't get government quarters right off, and your quarters were very, very difficult to come by. So we had a sleeping room, and then the other couple had a sleeping room, and we shared the kitchen and we shared the bathroom. So there was two rooms, kitchen and a bathroom. And the guy was a German, patrolman. He was equivalent to our state patrol is what he was. And he had been in the army. Well, of course, they were nice, neat, clean people as far as that goes. Most of you Germans are. But as it turned out, he thought they should have won the war. So really even though he shared the apartment, and he did so because financially he had to almost, but after a while we found out that he really did not deep down like the Americans, even though he shared the apartment. Now, occasionally you go out to some guest house, and guest houses, restaurants and stuff, to have dinner or lunch or what have you. You might be drinking beer and this and that. You'd hear, well, if it hadn't been for the weather or something, Hitler would have survived and we would have won the war. It wasn't totally without support. No, it wasn't totally. But by and large, it was no real big thing. There was some, especially with the younger ones, you get to drinking and mingling with them while they tell you that they should have won the war.
So, when did you leave Germany?
I went there in November of '54, and then I left in November of '56.
So you came back to the United States?
Came back to the United States, and that was when I was drafted, as I told you. I got out of the service, stayed out about 7 months. And I always remember the good times I had in the service, and to be honest with you, it took quite a pay cut to come back into the service. But I was never regretted that decision one day.
So you re-enlisted.
Right.
What sort of, did you perform the same job that you had before, or there's different training involved?
Okay. I had made sergeant while I was in the Army for 2 years, so I went down to the recruiter and asked him before I came back in the service if I could keep my sergeant's rank if I re-enlisted to come back in the service. So he said, well, let me give you a test and we'll see. So he gave me a test. I said, yeah. So I came back in as sergeant, and as I told you before, I was with the 4th Infantry Division. Well, I went to Fort Knoxville, Kentucky again for a reassignment. And waited there about 2 weeks for assignment, and they finally assigned me to Sandia Base, New Mexico. That was where near Los Alamos, if you recall, where they had made and were still making the atomic bomb. So we went to Sandia Base there, and that was a very, very nice post. And I worked there in intelligence, and it was a different branch of service, different branch from the infantry. And yeah, everybody there had to have a top secret clearance. Matter of fact, that's why I didn't know that time. That's why I didn't get to leave for 2 weeks. I was assigned there originally, but they didn't tell me that. But they have to make a preliminary background investigation on you. And if they don't think you can get a top secret clearance, they won't send you there in the first place. So that's where they sent me there. I really enjoyed that. Stayed there 4 years.
So what sort of duties in the intelligence field did you do? What would be your typical day, for instance? Okay,
typical day there was we were mostly support. We had a lot of visitors that came there, like congressmen and busloads of congressmen and this type of people come there all the time. You can about imagine that because everybody wanted to get involved and see what's going on. Of course, everything was top secret there at that time. And we mostly, to answer your questions, we mostly provided support for all these people. I did not get into where they were making this stuff. I went out in the desert where they were testing it, test bombs quite often, and saw some of that at a distance. And we were mostly, what you'd say, backup and security personnel. A lot of security there that you had to be performed and this type of thing. But we're quite good there. We only worked like from 8 to 5 is just like office hours. We never worked on the weekend. Matter of fact, we didn't even have field gear there, so we didn't have to go out in the field and train that type of stuff. So it was good assignment from that standpoint. And my second son was born there, so it give us a good family start there and everything. That was real good.
But you mentioned that you saw some of the test bombs go
yes.
up at a distance. What were your reactions when you saw an explosion of that magnitude?
That's really that's interesting. I just saw in last night's paper where they say now that I never knew that you couldn't tell where you were at. But anyway, in the Army Times yesterday said the soldiers can now tell where they went and saw these tests and what have you. I didn't know it couldn't before, to be honest with you. But anyway, to answer your question, that's quite an experience, to go out in the desert and know that some big explosion that is going to, you just, half the earth's going to be blown away, but you really know it's not. But it's really, it's quite an experience. It's very good. Then when it happens, then you go through, detectors. They're checking your clothes and they're checking you here and checking you there. And then you probably wind up taking 6 or 7 different showers and different types of showers before you can get out of the place. So, which I'm sure was all good for you. And now you're looking back on it, it gives you a kind of different perspective of it. And then, of course, they're always telling you, you can't tell none of this stuff, which we didn't. We really didn't know what to tell, to be honest with you. Heck, all I saw was big flashes, but you can't tell where you've been or how far it is here, or how many showers, or how many different clothes you wore, this, that, and the other. It was quite an experience. Quite an experience.
When you were able to witness it, I don't know exactly how you stand about when we decided to drop the bomb on Japan, but when you saw the explosion, did it give you obviously gave you a certain amount of insight that maybe you didn't have before. Did it sway your opinion of whether or not we should have dropped the bomb, or did it just reinforce it?
Well, at that particular time, of course, I had never been to Vietnam. And and the atomic bomb hadn't been dropped too long. Of course, this was 1950 or 57. Hadn't been too long since it was dropped in Japan, and there was a lot of talk about it. There was still a lot of stuff about the bomb at that time. And when you saw that, and you see it out there, and it's so destructive, and you just wonder, how can someone do that to a city or something, drop something of that magnitude on people, on children, or on civilians, and let it explode. That's just, you just couldn't hardly visualize something like that taking place. But then, after you have seen a war, I told you I've been to Vietnam 3 times now. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. But after you've gone through a war, I have learned, if I put all my experience together now, is the first thing you've got to remember about a war. The first thing. And I am really encouraged. It doesn't seem like the United States is very fast learners. Never get involved in a war unless you are prepared for total destruction. Never, but never commit troops to a country unless you're willing to totally destroy it. Now I'm talking about, for example, in Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, in Iraq. That's terrible to say, but if you go there and you're going to fight, then you've got to fight to win. Fight to win, and you're going to kill women, you're going to kill children, and you're going to kill babies. That's war. But that is war. If you're not willing to do that, then stay home.
Right.
Stay home. Stay home.
So do you feel like, this might be a little bit off track, but you feel like maybe we shouldn't have gone to Kuwait? You think maybe we only did half the job?
Oh, there's no question of mine. In Iran, in Iraq, I think we only did, again, half of the job. Saddam Hussein's still there, isn't he? He's still there, right? The least we could have done is had him to come out on the desert. You come out, Saddam Hussein, and you sit down at the table, and you sign him, and then arrest him for war crimes.
Yeah,
right?
Good point. Very good point.
Or take all of his army from him. Now he's going there, he's telling us what to do.
Right.
He's telling you where your inspectors will go. So you really haven't done that.
Right.
You haven't done that, right?
At all.
I'm telling you what you've done. You haven't done that.
Nothing. It's good to hear this.
So you've got your soldiers all out. While they're there, take it.
Mm-hmm.
Just say, okay, you're not taking these soldiers and this army back to Iran. The equipment isn't going back. Just get in front of it. Do what has to be done. There you have to be prepared to do what has to be done. And I underline that.
It's good to hear that because, obviously, the experience I have can't compare with anything you've had, but I had a U.S. military history course, and I got into a rather heated debate with my professor because that was the stance I had, is that if we go over there and we don't do the job right, if we don't clean it all up the first time, then we'll be back there in a matter of years. And unfortunately, it seems like we haven't learned that lesson.
I mean, really, that's what it's got to be. There's no other way.
That's true.
There's no other way. If you can't, when you commit American soldiers something, for God's sake, because I saw this in Vietnam. You see, I alluded to 3 times I went through Vietnam. People today don't know what happened in Vietnam. They do not know. I've seen movies. That's not what happened in Vietnam. But you go to Vietnam and you fight. Here's the guy. Okay, so you surround a battalion of North Vietnamese cavalry. You get them all surrounded out here. Americans are all around them. Here's we'll say 1,500 battalion, well-trained North Vietnam soldiers. They're surrounded, cut off from their supplies. Now, you've got them. You can capture them. You've got them cut off. Now, wouldn't you think you'd do something about that?
Certainly.
Okay, you know what happened to Vietnam? And this is the proof what happened to Vietnam. The order would come down, okay, you've got them all surrounded, you cut them off from all their supplies, now back off and let them go. So you back off and you let that battalion go. This happened time after again. And you know what they do? They go north, they resupply, get all of their weapons updated, what have you. 3 weeks later, they're over here on the north or the south or the other border, the same battalion, killing American soldiers. And you just go around in a circle. We didn't do nothing. We didn't do nothing in Vietnam. Nothing. And we fought there from 66 to 74. We're in equipment and can't even as much as whip one little country. And they ran us out of Vietnam. They literally ran the Americans out of Vietnam. Ran them out. They were raising the flag when the helicopter left in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. It was raising the flag when they shot the American flag down. Now, so you don't do stuff like that. I'm not here preaching war.
Right.
War should be avoided at all costs. At all costs, war should be avoided. It really should, because that is a terrible, destructive thing. It really is. It's terrible. That should be the last resort.
So when you left, we'll get back more to Vietnam, because that's very interesting to me. That's something I hope you have a lot more to say about. After you left Mexico, where did you go from there?
Okay, that's interesting. I left New Mexico. It's 1960, 61. I came out on order. Personnel called me up one day and says, "You're going to Germany." I said, "Okay, fine." Well, it was about 3 or 4 days later when they called me back and they canceled. Said, "You're not going because the guy that you're going to replace in Germany has been extended because of the Berlin crisis." You might recall then we had the Berlin crisis in 61 in Germany. And Berlin crisis meant they froze all those soldiers in place there and didn't allow no transfer in there for about a year. So then I get an alert that I'm going to Vietnam. Now this is 1961. Vietnam. I do recall looking it up, seeing where it was at on the map. Of course, I knew nothing about Vietnam. But that fell through, too, and they didn't send me to Vietnam. And then a year later, sure enough, they sent me back to Germany. That was 1962. And I went back to Germany. And that's when I told you earlier that I couldn't believe how much progress had been made since I'd left in 1957, I guess. 56 or 6. But that's where I went back to, and then stayed there in Germany for 4 years in Heidelberg till 62 to 66.
Were you performing the same type duties? Were you still in intelligence?
No. This time I was in transportation. So I was in a car company in Heidelberg.
Okay.
In Heidelberg.
A lot of supply, logistics, that sort of thing.
A lot of logistics. I mostly was, I said I was in a car company. We mostly supplied support for, again, for the VIPs, for the generals and the congressmen and everything coming to USAR. Heidelberg was the home of the USAR headquarters. That was the 4-star general headquarters for all the command in Europe. And we had a lot of VIPs that come in there and stuff. So we provide them with transportation and stuff. So that was a good job too.
Well, from there, where did you go?
From there, then I stayed until 66, and I had just put in my paperwork to get a 2 years extension. It was a 3-year tour, and I stayed 3, and then I put in for 2, which would have made it 5. And after I spent 1 year, I got curtailed and was sent to Fort Lewis, Washington, to help activate the 4th Infantry Division. If you remember earlier, I told you I was with the 4th Infantry Division in Germany in 54, but then they deactivated it. Now they're activating it in Fort Lewis, Washington. This is 66 to send it to Vietnam. So I went there in 1966 and trained and helped train to prepare to go to Vietnam. And we filled up the division and went to Vietnam, deployed to Vietnam.
What was your rank at this time?
I was a sergeant first class, and I was fortunate enough to be assigned. At that particular time, a lot of people retiring rather than go to Vietnam. So NCOs, there was a critical shortage of NCOs and officers. Anyone eligible to retire, they retired. They didn't want to go to Vietnam. So I was an E7. That's 1 grade below a first sergeant, and I was assigned to a first sergeant's job there in the company that I went to in Fort Lewis. And matter of fact, I got promoted shortly after I arrived in Vietnam, and that was a break for me as far as that goes. But my job was first sergeant.
So you arrived in Vietnam. Where did you go from there? Where were you stationed?
Okay, in Vietnam, we went with I went with the 4th Infantry Division headquarters, and as I told you, we drew all of our equipment, everything. We drew our artillery pieces, our tanks, our trucks, and rifles, and everything was all new stuff and everything. We had to pack it and all this stuff. It took us it was almost 4 months to get it ready. So they didn't have no equipment in Vietnam for us, so they didn't need no bodies without equipment. So military believes cost conscious. So they have all these big ships taking our supplies. So we went by ship. And that's very unusual, but we went by ship, and we will sail out of Seattle, Washington. We was on the water for 29 days. So then we went, our port, we first came into port in Vietnam was in the Train, Vietnam. And there wasn't a port there, but they had to come out the sea lands and stuff and offload us and this and that and the other and bring us in and take us to convoys to our various places. And the division headquarters went from there up to the north to Pleiku, which is about, I guess 150 miles. 29 days on board the ship, and you're going to Vietnam and you did all the training for it and this and that and the other, but you really don't, you kind of relax. Not a whole lot of action at that time was going on in Vietnam. Of course, it was getting more each day. And anyway, I remember when we started off loading and we got communications with us all and everything, and I think it was our second convoy that had left there. I left the train heading to Pleiku when the lieutenant had been shot right in the head and killed instantly. And that's really, I can still remember that today. Then everybody knew that the war was for real. We weren't playing there really. It's for real. So it seemed like from that day on, it was just a different type of feeling for me.
It was very different from what you've been doing before.
Yeah, right.
A lot more serious.
A lot more serious. That's the word for it.
Well, what did you think when you went to Vietnam and you shipped there, you're on the boat for 29 days and you arrive? You first see Vietnam. Do you think, what are we doing here? Do you think this is a good idea?
Well, okay. I was with a car company again going to Vietnam, believe it or not. So they kept us in the train at the 1st Field Forces headquarters. That was our 3-star general headquarters. We stayed there in the train. And the rest of the division went on to Pleiku, which was about 150 miles north of there. So we stayed back there again for support for people coming in there to visit the higher headquarters there. We were with a car company. There was 100 of us here. I was the first sergeant of the car. So it was very interesting. There wasn't that much action right there at that time in the train going on. But all the people from out the boondocks, so to speak, come there. There was a big beach there, and they kind of took R&R there, if you will, or visited the headquarters and had big meetings and this type of thing. So it was pretty secure right there for us. But then that was at that particular time. Then later on, they got the North Vietnamese got to infiltrating in and breaking in. And of course, we got the more and more. It was sending more troops out into the field because the war is getting hotter and hotter, and they're needing troops here and needing them there and this, that, the other. And they got to killing some around the train. They hit our convoys, and then they got their big thing there in that train course was bringing in ammunition and all types of supplies. It was big operations. The facilities there getting supplies, and that became one of the major routes along with Saigon and Cam Ranh Bay for bringing all the supplies into Vietnam. When you got 1 million soldiers there, you really got to have a lot of supplies coming in to support it. So more and more we're building up, and more it's getting dangerous around there. Then really the attitude of the soldiers was, the morale was really sky high. It was, hey, this won't last a year. This is a little small country, and we'll have this over with in a year. We're home, and it's all forgotten. See, and that was really the attitude of them. And everybody just pitched right in and did their jobs. We never knew what a day off was. We worked 7 days a week. If you had to work all night long, nobody said nothing about it. You just do your job and we were taking care of, well, as far as feeding them, this type of thing. And, was get home, get our year in and get home. That was the motto. Get it in and get home. Then we made it. And then I remember after I was out of Vietnam for about, well, I went back to Germany because we were short in Vietnam, or short in Germany, excuse me. So I go back to Germany and I'm there about a year, and here it is in the paper where the North Vietnamese had broken into the train and just annihilated that city there, and there was bodies buried right in the streets there where they dug a big hole and buried a lot of the civilians, the South Vietnamese and stuff. And the Americans didn't think they could get in, but they did. Well, some like Tet offensives, in the 69 Tet offensives and stuff. And I got to think about that, a lot of the people there that I'd seen come over and replace us and stuff, probably some of them was killed at that time. But at that time it was save your skin. I went back in 69. And the first thing I thought was, of course, that time I flew over, so it was not over right away.
Great.
And I was signed to Pleiku at that time. I was up in the mountains, up where they have a lot of mountain yards and stuff up there. So I was assigned to a heavy truck company. And we were hauling in and out of not Cam Bay, but Cambodia. Some questions where we were going into Cambodia. I remember reading in the paper, where are the American troops in Cambodia? Were they not in Cambodia? Yes, we were in Cambodia. We were hauling arms out of Cambodia. We'd go over and capture them, and they'd capture me, and we'd go over and bring the arms out and destroy them and stuff like that. But anyway, the morale of the soldier was terrible. I mean, we had racial problems, we had drug problems, we had command problems, we had problems you wouldn't believe, and it was really a bad. And I can about halfway understand it. Here we are, 69, but you got to understand we had a lot of young soldiers there. Young soldiers. So we had our big Stars and Stripes paper. That's the only way we had to daily communicate. It was a fine paper. You get the latest ball scores and you get all your home news and this and that. Well, if you look at 1969, here's Congressman so-and-so says you're not even supposed to be in Vietnam in the first place, Here you've got big problems in Detroit. You got riots, you got tanks. I don't know if you know it or not, but check your history. You had tanks firing downtown Detroit in the 69. I don't remember. Along that period, I'll use 69. You had the churches being burned in the South. You had, and then you had the good communist stuff. We had what we call our Hanoi Han, the lady, the girl that come on in the morning. She stayed on 24 hours a day, and she really helped, with, hey, you black soldier, you're sharing the foxhole with the white guy, and you should be home. Then you see what Congressman so-and-so said this morning, and, what's to say they're not killing the black kids back in Georgia, or they're doing this, they're doing that, vice versa. They really played that up to the limit. Then you could get drugs, boy, I guess the heroin is really good, but you could get very plentiful, of course, in North Vietnamese, and make sure that the American soldiers got that. And I'm not saying all Americans were drug addicts. Don't get me wrong on that. I guess the one thing was more about hurt the morale was probably the racial problems, and then the divided back home of us being in Vietnam. Not about 50% of the people felt you shouldn't even be there. You know, as it turned out, one president wouldn't even run because of the controversy. And you know, that's really hard for 18-year-old, 19-year-old soldiers to take. So, of course, I was older. I was the first sergeant. I was more, I was older and more experienced. I'd been there one time. And I was more prepared for stuff like this. And it was really hard on the American soldiers. But by and large, under the circumstances it was involved. And then again, I go back to what I was telling you. What good would it do if you go out here and you do a good job, you surround a battalion, or you do this or this, that, and the other, or you take 10 acres of ground, or you advance 10 miles north. Tomorrow you got to come back and give it all up, you know. So why do this? I mean, it was a morale killer for the American soldiers. I mean, it was there, you know. And now we're strung all over. We're in the South. We're down deeper in the South, you know, and we can't get north. And it was a no-win situation. It really was. And I often wonder, why did they let this go on? Why let this go on? Why not end it? Let's just go home now. If we're not going to fight, let's just get the heck home, you know. Just go home. Why let American soldiers continue to die? And a lot of American soldiers died there. There was 60,000 soldiers died there. And even your officers, you know, a lot of them knew it was wrong. It became survival for everybody. And you've heard of the Fragans in Vietnam. It happened occasionally. I don't think it was as widespread as it could. By and large, they tried to do as much as they could to help the soldiers. You know, they give them the R&R after 6 months and various things, and try to get them back to some of the beaches in Vietnam as often as they could. And Command did a good job on that, but you know, there's just certain things you can do to camouflage your real problems and stuff like that. And just keep dragging it on. And then, lo and behold, I got out there in 60, left in 70, and went to Phoenix, Arizona. Had a good job there. I was an advisor to the National Guard in Phoenix, Arizona for a year and a half. And then they come up and tell me in 71 I'm going back to Vietnam. I said, no, you got the wrong guy. I said, I'd done been there twice. I guess my tour was just, but I'd had 2 successful tours there, and now they're closing down, so they need good people there to close down and get out of Vietnam. And I said, successful means I'm alive, right? And I said, well, I'm not going because there's people, and there was people with my MOS and my grade that hadn't been to Vietnam first time.
And now they're asking you.
Now we're asking me to go 3 times.
Yeah.
So, make a long story short, in about 2 months I was back in Vietnam. And lo and behold, when I get back in Vietnam, the guy I'm replacing has been in his room drunk for a month and a half. And he's a first sergeant. You know, but I guess he got scared of the racial problems and, you know, all this, that, you know, that's very difficult to take. You know, you understand problems like that?
Well, I can't say I understand it to that.
No, you don't understand it, but you know, that's the kind of problem we had, you know.
Yeah.
And then now it's 71, and sure enough, we're closing down. We're moving. I was signed in down in Mekong Delta, down in Canton. That's way down south of Saigon, about 75 miles. So what we're doing, what my job was now is signed to a tanker truck company, and we were having companies come in. They'd be down to like 15 or 20 people, and they'd attach them to us, see. Then we'd turn in their equipment for them, and then they'd go on home, you see. So that would do away with that company. And then we just kept drawing back. And then as we draw it down, we'd move back up towards Saigon. So everything's moving right into Saigon. And so I stayed there a year, and we moved all the way up. I guess we were within 20 miles of Saigon when we come my year came up, and then I came on home. When I came home, I think there was like 12 or 15,000 soldiers left in Vietnam. From one experience, or from one thing, I went there in 66 when they had the big build-up. We were building them up. I went there in 69 when they had their maximum. And I left there in 72 when, you know, they were almost down to nothing. Of course, they hung on for another year or more there in Saigon and stayed. But it was a bad thing.
Well, how did you feel? Obviously, like you said, you were older when you got to Vietnam. obviously you had seen the military, like you'd seen the Army and thought a lot of it. And all of a sudden you're in Vietnam, and you mentioned the race was suddenly a problem, the racial issues, and obviously you weren't getting as much support from as home as you should have. How did that make you feel about the Army? How did that make you feel about the branch that you were in? I mean, did you feel like maybe it was partially the Army's fault, or did you think the Army did fine? It's just let down by the civilian leaders and such?
No, I felt it was the Army. I felt the Army was doing as good a job as they could do under the circumstances. I really did. I thought maybe there's times when, and I don't know up at that level, when maybe General Westmoreland, should have been more strong with the president, if that's where he was getting his orders from. And, we got a lot of that stuff in Vietnam. Oh, well, Congress says we can't do that. Why can't we go to North and bomb them? Congress won't let us do that. So, if that be the case, then he should have been more strong with him, or General Abrams when he replaced Westmoreland too. They should have been more strong and said, look, I give up. We're coming home. Either let us do a job or get us the heck out of here. It's that way. And of course, maybe when you get up to that level, you go along with it. But you should, obviously there was bad decisions being made. Bad. And now that you read McNamara said, I knew it was a no-win situation.
Yeah.
Now he says, I know it was a no-win situation. Well, if he knew it, why in the hell didn't he bring us home?
Exactly. Why say this now?
So, it was, to me, I strived on the things like, I remember we went to Fort Lewis and we got the company ready, how hard the guys worked. Mm-hmm. How we went to Vietnam our first year there, how hard they worked. I remember when they had a leprosy camp outside of that train when we were there. And he asked the guys to ride home and maybe get some things for them because the people really needed everything. They needed clothes. They needed anything. And here we got cookies and we got boxes of clothes and candy. No, it's okay. Sure. But the soldiers were really good. So, when I kept thinking, we'll get good one of these days. This will be over. That's the way the Army should be. That's the way it will be. And lo and behold, that's the way it is now. We lived through that, and then we went on to Germany. I came home, went back to Germany in about 70. I went to Germany that time. We had some racial problems there. That was in 1973. But then we began to get much better after that. Vietnam was over with. Then we came with the draft, or not the draft, but the all-volunteer. And that didn't, matter of fact, that was the worst thing the Army ever did was start the all-volunteer. It should be draft today. Because generally you get better soldiers in the draft than you do with all-volunteer Army. And I'm not saying we don't have good soldiers today. We do. We have outstanding soldiers. They're paid well, and they have to perform, or they just throw them out of the Army. They kick them out of the Army, so to speak, or fire them out of the Army, I guess it is. Now, in today's Army, you can get fired out of the Army in about 2 or 3 days. So it's a pretty good incentive to do your job. If you like the Army, you want to stay in. But anyway, with the 74s and on up through there, the Army started improving. They started spending a lot of money with new equipment, lots of new barracks and training and good officers, good NCOs. I left the Army in 1985. I feel that about 80 we had the Army back to probably where it was in the 66 era. And now I think that was very shown that way when we went to Iran, what a good Army we had, and how precise that everybody performed their duties, and how good our equipment works and everything. Army is just as good as your government will let it be. First, they've got to give them good equipment. They've got to train them well. And then the rest is to the order. So, my God, we've got all of those ingredients now. And I think if it was ever proven, it wasn't proven in Iran. And today, we have some 20 or 30,000 soldiers in Bosnia. Performing excellent duties, right? They built bridges over there, which you don't believe, and build them under the most strenuous conditions of weather. I wonder if people really knows what went on in Bosnia, or is going on, I should say. If they saw the bridges, the pontoon bridges being built, and under those conditions, and how our soldiers perform. That's the type of soldiers that American people need. But also, I say again, in the war is it's just it's very bad. It really is. But unless first of all, I should make 100% sure before they go to war but then after they go to war, they should never let nothing happen like in Iraq or Vietnam. American soldiers they deserve better than that. It couldn't turn out like I feel Vietnam, the war turned out, it was really a war against Americans. And it shouldn't have been that way. Okay.
Well, your career in the military, you've done me the favor by talking with me. I very much appreciate it. I want to go on, teach history, etc. What would you tell me to keep in mind when I'm teaching students about Vietnam, about the Army, about military history? Someone like you've been there and you know better than I, what would you tell me and other future teachers to instruct America?
Okay, first of all, they should make sure to get the facts. Make sure that it's the facts. Because I say this because I've heard so many things about Vietnam, and they have so many Rambos, and so much of that garbage, and you see so many movies where the soldiers downtown Saigon and they're with the horror, pardon the expression, or they're with this. You think they were gangsters. They never did nothing good, That's not the way it was. That's not the way it was. You had basically, I remember one day when we had a terrible situation down in the barracks where there was remember I told you that we were coming in out of the boondocks and signing bus and we were coming home. And this little postal unit came in. There was 6 of them over there taking a shower. It happened to be 6 white guys. One black guy out on the guard. He had his M16. He was strung out on drugs. He came through the makeshift barracks, and those guys were taking a shower, and he just took his M16 and sprayed them all, killed all 6 of them. But that was an isolated case. And he didn't do it because they were white or they were black who had done it. Regardless. His mind was on drugs he had in his arm. The guy died in about a week. He was just eat up with drugs. But, I could turn that around and make it any way I wanted. Right or wrong? Exactly. That was a hell of a racial. They didn't care. And the people clapped the black people clapped because he did it. It's not really true. A lot of black people were really totally upset about that. And you say, well, I thought you had racial. We did have a racial problem. We had pretty severe, but when it comes to something like that, they come great. But anyway, a lot of American soldiers did good things. They really were interested in doing a good job. Most American soldiers really were. And when I say the facts, what do you mean by the facts? Well, how come the morale in the country was low? How come it was low? Well, how much support did the young American soldier have when he was in Vietnam? How would you like to go to Vietnam, far away from home, and break up your engagement or what have you, and then hear your congressman tell you in the paper and on the radio that you shouldn't be there, and he's going to cut out funds for you. Matter of fact, he won't even pay you come payday.
Right. Exactly. There you are. You're not being supported at all.
You're not supported at all, right. Not supported one bit, okay? That's what I mean by getting the facts. And were we outnumbered? We lost in Vietnam, but what we lost because we didn't fight the war like we're supposed to fight. We fight from 66 to, I'll say, 74. You're fighting a little old country and you have all the modern stuff in the world here. You let them defeat you. I would answer your question. Yes, I think it's a very good thing. It should be taught. And it should be taught that the civilians here in America have just as much to do with the war as the soldiers out fighting. They have just as much. They are responsible for the morale of their soldiers. They are responsible for the support of their soldiers. And if they don't feel that way about it, then they should get their soldiers at home. It's a two-way situation. It's for the country. It's not for 100 officers or 100 NCOs. It's for the America, the whole entire America. And if the whole entire America is for you or against you, that's where you have to go. Majority must rule. Majority must rule. I think it's great that they're teaching it, military, in the schools. I really do. And I think we should learn from these things. And everyone should learn. And everyone should learn their responsibility.
Okay. Well, that being said, is there anything you'd like to say about the interview, about anything you want to add, or anything at all? It's your moment.
No, not really. I wouldn't take nothing in the world from my 32 years of military life. I feel I made the right decision. It's just a great experience, and I've worked hard and met lots of good soldiers, and I was glad to see at the last, in the later 70s, the female soldiers coming in the Army doing such a good job. I think they do a fantastic job, and they're really. I love the Army, and I think we should support our Army in all phases, and which I believe at this particular time we are pretty well supportive of our services. Of course, you still hear some stuff, about Bosnia. Well, I don't know if I'd send them or I wouldn't, and that we shouldn't hear that. Thank God most of them say, well, I don't really support it, but since they're there, we will support it. So that's kind of it's not a Democratic or Republican situation, is what I'm saying when we're at war. That's not what it is. It's not Democrat. It's not about that. It's not about who gets elected. And when that stuff starts happening, that's people playing with your life. Exactly. They're playing with your life to get them elected or get somebody else defeated. And that is wrong. That's wrong. So anyway, I've enjoyed it. Okay. And I hope we always keep a strong Army, because you need one. Even with the modern weapons we have today and what have you, you still need them, as you see in Iran and all these other places. I think if we didn't have them, the third world would take over. I think our wars will be fought much different in the future. No question about that. I think maybe Iraq was a kind of an example as to what we might have in the future. But Iran and they're crowing, North Korea crows, and this, that, and the other. And those things they're out there. And I hope nothing never happens, but something can happen. And we got to be prepared for those things that could happen. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts.